speaking for an hour, about an hour, and then it's open for question and answer. Please.
Thank you. Well, it's very nice to see you all. Thank you for spending some time this afternoon for us to talk about global warming and what Americans think about this issue. I want to begin by thanking Maria again for her heroic efforts to arrange this visit. We met each other when she was visiting at Stanford last year and leveled this invitation that I come, which sounded wonderful to me because I had, as some of you know, a wonderful visit to Sweden 10 years ago when I was on tour here playing drums with my jazz group. We were around the country in various places that I can't really pronounce very well, like Växjö. What's the right pronunciation of that?
Växjö.
Växjö. Okay, so that's something. You can get the idea. Down southeast, you know. And so it's really nice to be back and to have the opportunity to visit this great university and meet so many wonderful faculty members here and students and hear about the research that's going on. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to reciprocate at least a bit by telling you about the work that we do. The story today involves straightforward survey research and social science using a variety of different methods. It comes at its core from my perspective. My PhD is in social psychology, so I'm always focused on psychological process underlying what I study. And so I'm not just measuring what people think, but I want to understand why they think what they think. It's delightful when we as academics have the privilege of doing research in an arena where our colleagues find it interesting. We can publish it in journals. Life goes on happily in a kind of low-key way without too much disruption. This is not that. This work I'm going to tell you about is work that has become remarkably visible and contentious. There have been a number of people who have challenged the validity of what I'm going to tell you, and it's because I think there's so much at stake. There is a great deal, there has been, and now is again, a great deal of interest in this issue in the United States. You know that President Obama revisited this issue beginning his second term. As soon as he was inaugurated, during his inaugural address, he talked about climate change, and he talked about it in the State of the Union address. It's clearly an agenda item for this administration, which means all of a sudden government is again interested in what the public thinks. And so what I'd like to do is to walk you through the adventure that we've had, beginning in some sense with this starting point. If you turn the clock back to 2008, when John McCain and Barack Obama were running for the presidency of the United States, they disagreed about just about everything, except one. They agreed about climate change. If you look at their websites, what you'll see at that time were essentially the same statements. Global warming is real, it's been caused by humans, it's a threat, government needs to take action, and here are a series of specific policy prescriptions, including, number one, cap and trade. So this was a particular policy strategy for reducing future emissions. Both of them said that. In American politics, this is almost unheard of, to have the candidates from the Republican Democratic parties running for president agreeing at such level of specifics. So if we as observers were going to make one prediction in October of 2008 before that election, we would predict that who knows what's going to happen during the next 4 years, but we know for sure legislation will be passed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, no matter who gets elected. So what happened? It didn't happen. So the starting point for today, why no action? What is it that so surprisingly led to that outcome following 2008? So I want to propose a series of hypotheses and work through these hypotheses with you one at a time. And they really essentially all point to the American public as being at fault. So the first hypothesis is that maybe Americans actually don't believe what those two candidates said. That maybe most Americans are skeptical about the fact that the question of whether the planet has been warming, are skeptical about whether it's a threat, and are not inclined to have government do anything. So that's one possibility. A second possibility is that there are important differences between regions in the United States that were consequential in this process, and I'll explain why when we get to that place. A third possibility is that maybe Americans are largely green on the issue, and maybe there are not problematic regional differences, but maybe people just don't attach a high priority to the issue. That is, in 2008, you might remember, at the end of 2008, at the time of the election, we had a little bit of an economic meltdown in the United States. And so maybe people said, well, look, the priority for this administration needs to be fixing the economy. Worrying about the environment is a luxury that we don't have the resources for at the moment. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that people did prioritize it, but they didn't realize what the cost would be to reduce emissions in the future. I think it's pretty clear from many experts that significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the future will involve financial costs, and maybe the public was not willing to pay those costs. That's a possibility. Yet another possibility is that this issue did not influence voting, and I'll explain why that might be a barrier as well. So I think that's probably, out of this outline, that's about how far we're going to get today, and it'll bring us through this series of questions about whether maybe no action is the fault of the American public. So let's start. Part one, a portrait of public opinion through our most recent survey. So, sorry, let me just go back for a second and show you this opening slide. So you see here the list of organizations that have funded the research that I'm going to tell you about today. So the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford and Ohio State University were my two universities when I did this work. There are a series of news organizations listed here. The National Science Foundation is a part of the federal government, as is the Environmental Protection Agency and NOAA. So federal agencies have funded this work. And Resources for the Future is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. with a particular focus on environmental policy. So these are all surveys that I'm going to tell you about done over this 15-year period in collaboration with these organizations, partly funded by them. And so that gives you that background. So in order to begin part one here and to think about what has the public been thinking over this time period, let's begin with a few quotes, people making claims about what the public believes. So here's the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, who said, "The public has not really understood the issue of climate change very well, nor have they understood the role they play in greenhouse gas emissions. We need a major effort to educate the public." Or John Sturman in Science magazine, "The strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to the widespread confusion and complacency among the public." Seems a little bit like finger pointing or blame, huh? Or how about November 2010? "The number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall," said Bloomberg Businessweek. Or in February 2011, "Why don't Americans believe in global warming?" asked The Economist. So these are clearly strong statements. My favorite of all, in 2012, "The public has caught on and believes the global warming issue is dead," said Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma in the United States. So clearly, lots of people think that Americans are not believing and endorsing and prioritizing this issue in a way that would lead to pressure for government action. So are they right? Where does all that come from? Does it come from survey evidence? Well, I don't think so. And I'll show you what at least our survey evidence looks like. What I want to do is walk you through a series of surveys we've done between 1997 and 2012. These are all surveys done with representative national samples of American adults. So this is, you can think of it as a random sampling of the adult residents of the United States. All of the surveys I'll tell you about involve interviewing by telephone. So this is a technique called random digit dialing, where the way we do it, our telephone numbers, have 3 numbers as an area code. The next 3 numbers are called a central office code, and then the last 4 digits follow that up. So the way we generate random samples of numbers is we take every existing combination of area code and central office code, and we add 4 randomly generated digits to the end. And we do that to generate lots and lots of numbers, and then we call those numbers in order to find out which ones are working and which are not. So that way we're reaching numbers that are listed in the telephone book, as well as numbers that people say they don't want to have listed in the telephone book. Every number has an equal probability of being sampled. And by the way, we call landlines and cell phones to cover the population fully. I am a person with a strong background in survey questionnaire design. I obsess about question wording and lose sleep over that. So I will walk you through a bit of the careful work that we try to avoid bias. So let's begin here by looking at what I'll call the fundamentals. Has the planet been warming? Has it been caused by humans? And is it a threat? If Bloomberg Business Week is right, then this number should have been dropping dramatically, right? That would be free fall. And if Americans don't endorse these basic points, then there's no need to go on, right? There's, in their opinions, there is no problem to be solved. So let's see. So here's our question that we've been asking for quite some time to measure the first of the fundamentals. So it asks, you may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? Okay? So you'll notice it's a balanced question that expresses both points of view equally saliently. So just think for a minute, based on what you know, what percent of people in America would you guess would select this first answer? And what would a graph look like over time across those years? And here's what it looks like. So you should stop breathing just for a second here when you see this for a couple of reasons. First of all, these are gigantic numbers. In the United States, we can't agree about just about anything, right? They're like, you think of the country as split about evenly red and blue. Presidential elections are won 53-46. This is not a country where we have lots of unanimity, except on this issue, where there's remarkable unanimity. Beginning back in 1997, 79% of Americans said they thought the planet probably had been heating gradually. That number was at its height in 2006, 2007, dropped a bit, went back up, went down, still at about the same level it has been. Now, if Bloomberg Business Week were right, free fall would be like a very dramatic decline here. We don't see that. So, just as a starting point, if you were a skeptic about surveys, and if you said, you know what, surveys are so unreliable, you do the same survey twice, you get completely different results. No. Actually, you do the same survey multiple times, you get just about the same result over and over again. So, and furthermore, these ups and downs are actually real. They are predictable. And I'll explain to you later why they happen. They have causes. Second, what about human action? So the question here is, if the Earth has been warming gradually over the last 100 years, do you think it's mostly been caused by things people do, mostly caused by natural processes, or caused about equally by things people do and natural processes? Here are the percentages of people who said they thought it was that human activity was responsible. So we begin here in 2006 at 80%, rose a little bit to 83% in 2007. In our most recent survey in 2011, it's at 77%. No evidence of dramatic decline, a very large number. Now, when we put these two together, some people think, well, actually, this is not global warming. This is just temperature change. And this is not global warming. You've got to put the two of them together. What percent of people believe that the planet has been warming and it's caused by human activities? So when we put these together, you see slightly lower numbers. So here we begin at 70, we end at 62. But the trend over time is not dramatic. And again, clear majorities of people. Okay. Now, when we ask people, if the Earth's temperature were to rise by 5 degrees Fahrenheit in 75 years, overall, would that be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? So I apologize for Fahrenheit here. How many Celsius degrees is 5 degrees Fahrenheit? Like 1.5?
2.
2, okay. So a lot of people think the 2 degrees Celsius rise would be very bad, scientific experts. a majority, a bare majority of Americans agree with this. So this number started at 60% in 1997. It's 53% today. This, I think, is one of the points of the largest discrepancy between what natural scientists say and what the public says, that natural scientists would expect this number to be larger. Now, there's a group of people, about 15%, who think this warming would be a good thing, and they live up in the north. And there's a group of people who think it would be neither good nor bad. Now, one of the things to bear in mind here is that we can't know just from this result why people think it is not necessarily a bad thing. Because, for example, one potential reason would be for people to say, well, I think we need some warming because it will finally wake up our societies and we will abandon our addiction to fossil fuels and it will move us into green energy in the future. So overall, even though we will suffer in the short term, it'll be a good thing in the long term. That kind of reasoning and other kinds of reasoning could underlie this question. I've shown you nothing to illuminate that yet. Okay, now, so far what I've shown you is majorities, and in some cases huge majorities, endorse green views on the issue, and there has been no notable decline in these numbers. However, imagine that people say, well, okay, yeah, I think it's probably been happening. I think it's probably caused by humans. I think it's probably bad. But I'm not at all sure about that. Would uncertainty in public perceptions be a barrier to support for action? In other words, if somebody said to you, okay, we've done some tests, you might have cancer. And what we recommend is that you have this very serious treatment that would be very disruptive for you. And you say, well, how sure are you that I have cancer? And they say, well, we're not sure at all. I mean, you might, we really don't know. And then you might say, well, could you just figure this out and then get back to me? Because I'd be happy to consider really wrecking my life after I know for sure I have a problem. So if people are uncertain, maybe they're not willing to actually endorse a remedy. So let's look at certainty. Well, we asked people who said they thought climate change has been happening, how sure are you about that? I'm sorry, that everyone was asked how sure are they about their answer. These are the people at the top 2 points on our rating scale, extremely sure or very sure. And you can see this number has also not changed really since 1997 at all. There's been a tremendous education of the American public on this issue over that time period. Tremendous number of news stories, lots of discussion of the issue. People feel they know more now than they did 15 years ago about this issue. But their level of certainty has really not gone up. So, okay, so this is a minority of people who are really at the high end of certainty. Now, you can certainly imagine people would say, I'm not a scientist. I mean, I really am not in a position to be completely certain. That's fine. But let's see whether this level of certainty is a barrier to what might come later. Is it the case that people say, if I don't know I have the problem, I don't want the treatment? So let's see, does uncertainty impede support for action? What we'll do now is we'll look at whether people favor or oppose various policies that could be implemented to do what Barack Obama and John McCain said they wanted to do, reduce future greenhouse gas emissions and reduce future warming. So first, when we ask people, do you think the federal government in Washington should do more to deal with global warming than it's doing now, should do less, or should do about what it's doing now? The group of people who said they thought it should be more was a little less than 50% at the end of the 1990s, at a peak in 2006 and 2007, and has been holding steady at about 61% since then in 2012. So this is asking for more action. What policies do people support? Well, one commonly discussed strategy is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by businesses. So we ask people this question. It's kind of long. Some people believe that the United States government should limit the amount of greenhouse gases thought to cause global warming that U.S. businesses can produce. Other people believe the government should not limit the amount of greenhouse gases that U.S. businesses put out. What about you? Do you think the government should or should not limit the amount of greenhouse gases that U.S. businesses put out? Now, you might think for a moment what that number could be, because it's essentially a reflection of the desire for government regulation. And you know that most Republicans are Republicans based on the principle of limited government, based on the principle that government should not be limiting activities. So how big could this number be? Well, here's how big it is. 76%. So you don't get 76% of people saying the government should interfere in business without lots of Democrats and Independents and Republicans expressing that very same point of view. So that's a strong message. When we look at some other policies, these are questions that ask, should the federal government either require businesses or encourage them by offering reductions in taxes? That what we see, we asked here about car companies building cars that use less gasoline and therefore put out less emissions, building cars that only run on electricity, building appliances that use less electricity to run them and therefore produce fewer greenhouse gases, building more buildings that are more energy efficient, more insulated so they cost less to heat and cool, and mandating that businesses reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that they put out. And you can see that beginning in 2006, when we started asking these questions, more than 80% of Americans favored government involvement in these policies. That number actually dropped very interestingly for a little time period in 2012. There was a little dip, but it's now up to about 70% here most recently. The only one of these policies that's not so popular is building electric cars. And you know that in the United States, we're really not to the place where electric cars are easily practical for everybody. That they go 50, 60 miles on a charge, and we don't have arrangements for charging stations and simple ways to quickly get back up to speed, so to speak. So that's a technology which has not yet reached popularity at the same level. But even building electric cars received consistently greater than 50% support across these years. Here are another set of policies, all about tax incentives. So we asked a couple of questions based on recommendations that sometimes come from economists. So economists sometimes say, the best way to reduce emissions is to raise the price for consumers. And if it becomes more expensive, they will do less of it. So we asked people, do you think the federal government should increase taxes on electricity so that people use less of it? Or do you think the government should increase taxes on gasoline so people use less of it? So what do we see? Well, increasing taxes on electricity is favored by a tiny group of people, less than a quarter in most of these years. Surprisingly, increasing taxes on gasoline is favored by a slightly larger group of people. But both of these are clearly and consistently minorities. So just imagine, if the question were to the American respondent, do you think the federal government should reach in your pocket, take money out, and put it in its pocket just to cause you to change your behavior, just to manipulate you? Doesn't sound so great, right? There's no mention of what would happen to the money after it's taken out of your pocket. And it's not at all clear that there would be any benefit, right? So what we know from a policy like that is that if the price goes up on gasoline and electricity and everybody's buying gasoline and electricity, we know for sure everybody's going to pay more and have less money for other things. Is it really going to cause people to use less? Is it really going to help the environment? Maybe. And the economists might say it will. But as you know, the price of gasoline increased in the United States from basically $1 a gallon some years ago to about $4 a gallon now. And consumption hasn't plummeted at all. So you can imagine why Americans would say, don't do this. A, because I don't want to give you my money for no purpose. And B, I think it's no purpose. I don't think it's actually going to help. So that is not so popular. You also know that nuclear power plants generate electricity without emitting greenhouse gases. So many view that as a green technology. When we ask about government offering tax breaks to build more nuclear power plants, only in 1 year, 2009, did a majority of Americans favor that. In general, it's been below a majority. The more popular policies here are offering tax breaks to utilities to produce more electricity from wind, water, and solar power, or offering tax breaks to reduce pollution when burning coal. So this is carbon sequestration, other techniques, clean coal techniques, so-called. So the most popular strategies here are using more green sources and reducing emissions from current sources. Okay. Now, here are some more specific policy questions. Do you think the federal government should require power companies to make at least 20% of their electricity from water, wind, and solar power? So this was a part of a piece of legislation that was actually considered by Congress. 69% of Americans said government should do this. Carbon sequestration was described as follows. Should the government offer tax breaks to companies that burn coal if they use new methods to put the air pollution they generate into underground storage areas? 70% favor that. Cap and trade, the policy I mentioned earlier, described like this. There's a proposed system called cap and trade. The government would issue permits limiting the amount of greenhouse gases companies can put out. Companies that did not use all their permits could sell them to other companies. Companies that need more permits can buy them. Or these companies can pay money to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that other people or organizations put out. This will cause companies to figure out the cheapest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Would you favor or oppose this system? So this is, as I say, the centerpiece of what Barack Obama and John McCain proposed in 2008. 65% of Americans favored this. And in an experiment we conducted where some respondents heard exactly this question plus this additional phrase, this type of permit system has worked successfully in the past to reduce the air pollution that companies put out. For example, in 1990, the federal government passed a law like this, called the Clean Air Act, which caused companies to put out a lot less of the air pollution that causes acid rain. So here what we do is we not only tell people about the policy, but we tell them it's not new, it's not hypothetical, it actually has been tried before and it's worked, and public support rose to 74% in that case. Okay, so we've now come to a breathing point. What I've shown you is that majorities, or huge majorities, are on the green side of the issue in terms of the basics. Has the planet been warming? Has it been caused by humans? Is it bad? Do we need government to take action? And you know, those percentages of 65, 75, 80% of the public favoring those policies show you that uncertainty is not a barrier. You saw that many people are expressing only moderate or low levels of certainty. But at the same time, they are willing to pay this price, it appears, and we'll talk about price in a minute. They are supportive of government action at very high levels. So one of the arguments you might remember hearing a few years ago from opponents of policy in this area was to say it's a job killer, it's an economy basher, that if we try to reduce emissions in the future, it will only cause people to lose jobs, it will only hurt the economy. So how well did this argument catch on with Americans? Well, we asked people, did they think that the government doing things to reduce global warming in the future would cause there to be more jobs in the future, fewer jobs in the future, or would have no impact on the number of jobs? And the percent of people who said it would be hurting the number of jobs was only 18%. So that argument was not catching on with many people. What about this? Do you think that federal government doing things to reduce global warming would hurt the U.S. economy more broadly? And only 20% of people said they thought that would be true. In both of these cases, pluralities of Americans said that they thought actually doing these things would help the economy, would increase jobs, and so on. Next, we asked people, do you think the things people would have to do to stop global warming would make your own life better, worse, or neither better nor worse? Now, if you think of the process of reducing emissions, changing to a green energy economy, and so on, as being costly and painful, and yet you imagine the effects of global warming paying off decades or centuries from now, you could easily imagine people saying, you know what, to tell you the truth, yeah, I don't think I'm going to benefit a lot because the warming's not going to happen, but I certainly think I'm going to pay. I'll be hurt in the short term. And in fact, only 14% of people said they thought that their lives would be made worse by efforts to address climate change. 43%, the plurality, said they actually thought their lives would be better. Not surprisingly, more younger people than older people. Okay, so this now brings us to part two, which is the regional differences hypothesis, the we're different hypothesis. And so let me tell you how this came about in my research program. I showed you the kinds of evidence that we've been generating for some time. And in 2010, I wrote an essay that was published in the New York Times on the op-ed page about this, describing the fact that America was largely green on this issue. And Stanford, my university, said, oh, that's nice, lovely you did that. Maybe we should put you on a plane and send you to Washington, and you can meet with some senators and congressional representatives and their staffs and tell them about your research. So I said, okay. So I got on a plane and I flew to Washington and had meetings with those people in their sometimes big, sometimes not so big offices. And each time very hospitable, come right in, welcome, what do you have to talk about? So I would open my laptop and I would walk them through the kind of evidence that I just showed you. And consistently, overall, the response I got, one person after another, was, thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear about your national surveys, but I think the people who live in my state are different from the rest of the country. And I represent the people in my state. And so I need to be paying attention to them. So I said, oh, really? That's fascinating. You know, we've done a little bit of looking at differences across the country. We haven't seen much. I would love to see the survey research that you've done to learn about the people in your state. And they said, oh, we don't have any surveys. So I said, well, how do you know what people think? And they said, oh, from the letters and the phone calls and the emails and the screaming at me when I go home to meetings with the public in my state. I thought, okay. So I left those meetings, and I have to acknowledge, in the taxi going to the airport, I was pretty horrified. Because I thought, for all these years, that I had been doing something actually helpful to government by doing surveys to help the government understand what the public thinks. And I realized that I and all my colleagues are doing it wrong. That we were not actually doing it in a way that helped elected representatives. That the way our government's structured, they need to know, understandably, about the people who elected them and who they represent. And I was not providing that kind of data. And then I realized, maybe I can provide that kind of data. Because, in fact, I had done many national surveys of 1,000 respondents at a shot. And if I stacked up all of those surveys and then divided them up by state, I would have enough people in most states to be able to characterize the states. And as I showed you, the survey results haven't changed much over time. So the idea of combining across the years to get enough people in each state to actually make a statement was plausible. So we did it. And let me show you what we found. First of all, we're going to look at this issue of just the very basic issue. Has the planet been warming? So you can see here that the range of states, so there are 50 of them, of course, the range of states, the percent of people in the state who thought the planet had been warming was from a low of 65 to a high of 86. So this range indicates there was not a single state in the country where a majority of people were on the not green side of the issue, were on the skeptical side of the issue. So let me show you now a map. See if you can see it. You can see it? Good. Okay. And this map will give you a quick sense of where the greatest greenness is. What percentages of people were the largest on that side. So you can see that, first of all, we have a few gray states here, North Dakota, South Dakota, that are gray because even when we stacked all the surveys together, there just weren't enough people to make a statement. So we have nothing to say about them. But among the rest of the states, you'll see this range up from 65% up to 86. The lighter green ones are smaller numbers. The darker green ones are more sizable majorities. And you can see that this 86% happens to be in Arizona. Anybody know why that's significant? John McCain. John McCain, senator, is a representative of Arizona. Interesting. Look at Oklahoma. Second highest, at 85%. Do you know who the senator is from Oklahoma? No. James Inhofe, who I quoted earlier saying, Americans realize this is all a sham. Wow, okay? So that's quite different. So, but you can see where maybe smaller majorities are, Arkansas, Idaho, Ohio. But in general, even in those places, there are sizable majorities. Now, I could show you literally 20 more graphs that look like this for lots of other measurements we've made, and they tell the same kind of story over and over again. I'm just going to quickly walk you through a few others rather than drowning you in this evidence. So now, when we ask people if the planet's been warming, has it been caused by humans or not, those majorities range from a low of 64% to a high of 99%. This map looks, should the government do more? Here is one instance in which a majority of the states say no. Only 43% say government should do more, but there's only one state, and let me show you this. This is a bit of an older map for us, so it's a little bit different in its format. But the lowest, that one state where a majority is on the skeptical side is Idaho at 43%. The next lowest number is Missouri at 54%. The darker they get, the larger the majorities are. The next one after Missouri is 65% for Texas. So there's plenty of other darkness showing you those majorities growing larger and larger. Now, one hypothesis that some people have, you might have, is that in states where lots of people work in the coal and oil industries, that people would be reluctant to have government interfering in that arena. So what I've done is to circle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states that are the highest coal and oil states. And you can see that, you know, if the hypothesis were true, all of these would be light in color, but they're not. We've got Wyoming that's dark, New Mexico almost as dark, Louisiana almost as dark, and then some lighter ones. So it's not clear at all that those states are uniformly opposed. Now, their senators and congressional representatives often talk about their states as dependent on those industries in ways that discourage doing anything, but the public doesn't seem to think that way. Next, should the federal government limit greenhouse gas emissions by U.S. businesses? Again, 65% is the smallest majority and 96% the largest. So here's one more map. The 65 is up here in Maine, 66 in Arkansas, 69 in Utah, and all the rest getting darker and darker. Okay, so what's the conclusion? There's not one single state where the majority says, no, we don't buy this. The majority, and in many cases, huge majorities of states, say they believe in the problem and they would like to see action taken. Okay, so that's not helpful. Okay, what about this possibility? Imagine I'm in this conversation in Congress and I show the legislator what I've just shown, and they say, okay, you know, that's very nice, but Americans do not prioritize this issue. They're not placing this at the top of the list. There are many more issues they want us working on more than this one. And it's understandable because it's off in the future. So here is the survey question that skeptical legislator could cite to support this claim. This is a question that's been asked many, many, many times in American surveys. What's the most important problem facing this country today? This question is treated as an indicator of the most important problems that the public wants government to work on. And when we asked this question recently, when you asked it any time in the past, it has shown results that look something like this. This result comes after the economic meltdown in the U.S. Clearly the number one problem, the highest priority, is the economy. And over here in last place is global warming. Now the truth is, you see that little green bump there. I just put the little green bump there just to show you that I didn't forget about it. But the fact of the matter is, the percentage over here is 0. It's actually 0. Nobody cites global warming as the most important problem facing this country today. And so a legislator who doesn't want to work on this might say, well, these are the problems that we need to be working on, not something that Americans don't prioritize. But Sam Larson, who is an undergraduate working on my research team, looking at this result, asked the question, you know, is it possible that maybe this question is mischaracterizing the priorities of Americans? And he said, well, you know, what if instead we asked a different question, like this? What will be the most important problem facing the world in the future if nothing is done to stop it? Okay? So what are we changing here? Well, first of all, we're talking about the future instead of the present. Secondly, we're talking about the world, not just the United States. And thirdly, we're talking about problems where if nothing is done to address them in the future. So let me explain the logic here. So imagine that when people think about this, they're asked this question. They say, well, climate change is not the most important problem facing only this country now. It's a problem that will face the country in the future. But if they say, but you know what, I actually don't think it's going to be a really big deal because I think we're going to do something about it. I think we're going to solve this problem before it actually happens. Well, that's why this last phrase is included, because we don't want people failing to cite it because of optimism. So we want to know, really, what will be the most important problem people think will face the world in the future. What do we get when we ask that? So global warming comes out in first place. Now, you might say to me, oh, that seems manipulated. You know, like when you write it this way, what else could people say besides global warming? Well, that is the result, right? That people do say other things, but the result is that more people select global warming in the environment than anything else. So that suggests that there is parity. Now, bear in mind, of course, this is a bit of an odd question because it only asks what is the one most important problem. It's as if each person is only allowed to have government work on one thing, which we know is not the case, right? We know that our government, your government work on many, many problems all at the same time. So it's a little silly. You know, it may be that when you ask about second and third, that global warming would be piling up even more. But you could imagine offering this hypothesis about Americans. You know, they're kind of parochial. That, yes, they say this. They say this is a problem that will face the world in the future, but they really don't care. They only care about their problems facing them today. So we asked a very simple follow-up question. How much effort do you think the federal government in Washington should put into dealing with the serious problems the world will face in the future if nothing is done to stop them? And we offered a rating scale. So here the question is, you know, do people say, yeah, that's a problem for the world should deal with it, but we don't need to deal with it? Or should we be putting effort into it? The answer is, when you combine just the top two categories on this rating scale, a great deal and a lot, 76% said the government should be working on that. So they're not quite so parochial after all. So lots of people want the US government working on the world's problems, not just only on our own. Now, I will tell you that some colleagues of mine in Canada saw that experiment and replicated it themselves with very similar wording. And what you can see here is when they asked the traditional most important problem question, the economy was mentioned a lot more than global warming and the environment. But when they asked the new question, the economy dropped considerably and global warming and the environment came into first place. So the same result was obtained in Canada as well. Now, here's the most widely cited result to make the claim that Americans don't prioritize the issue. This is a question from the Pew Research Center who asked, I'd like to ask you about priorities for President Obama and Congress this year. As I read from a list, tell me if you think each should be a top priority, important but a lower priority, not too important, or should it not be done at all? And one of them is dealing with global warming. So let me show you the results. So 25% said a top priority, 35% said important but a lower priority, so that's 60% saying it's important for government to work on. 20% said not too important, so this is 80% of people who said government should work on this, and only 16% who said nothing should be done by government on this issue. So regardless of how you want to look at these numbers compared to other issues, people are saying, large numbers of people are saying they want the federal government to be working on this issue. Okay. So now we finished whatever part, that's part 3, I guess, which is the priority section. And it does look like Americans prioritize and want government effort on this issue. What about this possibility? What about that people say this all sounds good to them in principle, but when you actually get down to it, that if it's going to cost money, they don't want to pay? Is that possible? So we actually asked this question. If the US Congress were thinking of passing a law that would reduce the amount of air pollution that the country puts out by 85% by the year 2050. And if that would cost your household an extra $150 in taxes every year on average, would you vote for this law or against it? Okay? So this is 1/3 of the survey respondents were asked this question, and they're asked about $150. Okay, now 85% by 2050 is about what Barack Obama said he wanted to achieve when he was running for president in 2008. And 58% of Americans said they favored that if the cost of their household was going to be $150 each year on average. Okay? But other respondents were asked about other prices, randomly selected. So 1/3 of the respondents chosen randomly were asked instead about $75. So knowing your economics, what should this percentage in favor be here, knowing that the price has gone down? Should be higher or lower? Higher. And it is, 66% favor at $75. What about for the people who were asked about $250? What should this be, higher or lower? Lower, and it is, 41%. So there's a sensitivity to price here. As price goes up, people are less willing to pay. That suggests that they're being sensible, rational economic consumers according to economic theory. Let me show you now that there's a way to take these three numbers, 66, 58, and 41, and calculate the average willingness to pay for the country as a whole. And the way we do it is we say, well, if 66% of people favor $75, then that means 34% of people oppose $75, right? So we know that their maximum willingness to pay is somewhere between $75 and 0. So we're going to put them all at 0, just to be conservative. Okay? Now, when we move from 66 to 58 here as the price increases, 8% of people drop out. They said yes to this and no to this. So we know that those 8%, their willingness to pay is somewhere between these two numbers. So we're going to be conservative again. We're going to put them at the bottom here, at 75. So 8% of people, we give them a value of 75. When we go from 58 to 41, 17% of people's maximum willingness to pay is somewhere in this region. So we're going to put all of them at $150. And lastly, this 41% says yes to 250. They might say yes to 350 and 450, but we don't know that because we didn't ask. So we're going to put all of those 41% at $250, multiply this up, average it out. With a downward bias, what we get is 117 million American households are willing to pay at least $17.7 billion every year for this policy. According to the EPA and the federal government in Washington, that's enough to pay for it. So willingness to pay is sufficient to cover these costs. Now, we also did another experiment where we asked about 85% reduction by 2050, and we did it in 3 states. Here we've started to actually do surveys in states. So this was a survey done only in Maine. For the people asked about $100 a year versus others asked about $150 and others asked about $200. Again, you can see the percentages in favor looking similar and going down. Same in Massachusetts, same in Florida. So at $100 a year, a majority of people support it. Even at $150 a year, a majority support it. And at $200, you lose the majorities barely in 2 out of the 3 states. This reinforces the same results I showed you earlier. Here's one other. This is a set of results that come from a joint survey we did with New Scientist magazine, which you know is based in the UK. We asked people about a series of 6 different policies, about vehicle fuel policies here and about electricity policies here. We asked about whether there should be mandates to reduce emissions or taxes or cap and trade. The important point I want you to see is in each of these cases, as the price went up, willingness to pay went down. The percent of people voting for the policy went down as the price went up. People are, when they answer these questions, sensibly responsive to price. Okay, so this now brings us to maybe the denouement of this whole story. So imagine that I'm talking to my skeptical legislator who says, okay, fine, you've convinced me that a majority of people think climate change is happening, they think it's caused by humans, they think it's a threat, they want government to take action, they want reduced emissions in the future, they favor lots of policies, they don't think the policies are going to hurt, they do prioritize the issue, they are willing to pay, but I don't think anybody actually uses this issue to vote in elections. And I got to make choices about where am I going to spend my time and energy while I'm in the Congress in order to get reelected. Because if I don't get reelected, I can't do anything on any issues. And if I spend too much time talking about climate change when it won't actually help me get elected, I'm sacrificing my own ability to help the country. Reasonable argument. So, okay, well, is that true? Well, there are a number of people who, after the 2010 congressional elections, offered speculations about whether climate change policy actually affected people's voting. So here's one headline. This headline from Politico said, Democrats who took risk and voted for the climate bill paid price. So what they're saying here is that the congressional representatives who were on the green side of the issue were hurt in voting. Okay. But another claim was cap and trade didn't kill the Democrats. So this is another organization saying that's not true. Yet another headline, it's not the climate bill, stupid, saying these votes didn't matter. And the last one, ignoring evidence, Politico spins climate vote as electoral loser. So claiming that, it's quite the contrary here. So these headlines were all published within days of the election. And there's no way within days of the election that anybody like me can do the kind of scholarship it would take to actually answer these questions and to address them. These are just people who are quickly speculating about the impact the issue had. So we've carried out an in-depth investigation using 3 methods, as I'll show you, to see whether votes were affected. But before, let's just talk a little bit about theory. So in political science, there's been lots of research done on understanding how people make candidate choices in elections. I'm not going to review the details of these fascinating bodies of research, but what we know is that there are sets of ingredients that influence people's voting decisions. So their affiliation with a party, their belief about how good of a job the current president is doing, how well they think the country's health is as a whole, whether the social groups they care about would be helped or hurt by particular candidates, whether the candidates seem intelligent, empathetic, honest, and so on. The emotions evoked by the candidates. Do the candidates make you feel proud and cared for, or do they make you feel worried? And lastly, there are the positions the candidates take on policy issues. Now, you might think that should be first on the list, but it's actually been a matter of considerable debate. There's one school of thought that says maybe Americans rarely think about policy. They're not saying, I want to vote for this person because that person will support the policies I care about. And the argument comes most importantly from Phil Converse in 1964 in a very important paper, in which he argued that most Americans don't even know what they want on most policy issues. And they'll answer a survey question, but it's not a real, genuine belief that they hold. And furthermore, they can't figure out what the candidates would do most of the time because the candidates are confusing. The candidates rarely state clear positions. They'll get asked a question, what's your position? And they'll say lots of words, but if you're trying to figure out what exactly would they do, it's hard to determine. And candidates often do what I'll call here hug the middle. That is, they say, well, there are pluses and there are minuses. I'm really in the middle on this issue. I can see lots of ways of going. This doesn't help somebody use that issue as a way of voting. On the other hand, in our literature, there's a second theoretical perspective called the issue publics notion. And this idea comes from Phil Converse in his 1964 paper, in which he said that for each issue, there may be a small group of citizens who are very passionate about that issue. People who wake up each morning and say, another day, another opportunity to influence the federal government on climate change, or gun control, or abortion, or whatever issue it is that they care deeply about. So each issue has its small group of people who feel strongly about it and push government in one way or another. And issue public members, Congress proposed, might pay close attention to what candidates say on the issue, and when the candidates don't take distinct positions, that these issue public members can infer differences between candidates. So they know enough about the issue to say, you know what, usually Democrats are much more oriented toward protecting the environment and Republicans are less oriented toward protecting the environment. So I don't need to hear these candidates say anything. I can make guesses about what they're going to do on my issue. And most importantly, maybe issue public members vote based on the issue. So my research team for the last 25 years has been studying this process, which I'm not going to walk you through, by which people become members of issue publics, and then there are psychological consequences of it. But I want to show you, first of all, that we have measured how big the issue public is on climate change. And you can see over this period, from 1997 to 2012, there actually has been some very notable movement in this number. So when it started off, there were 8% and then 11% of people who, when we asked them, how important is this issue to you personally, they said it's extremely important. They put themselves up at the very top of the scale. That number essentially doubled up to 17 or 18% in 2006 and 2007, plateaued a little bit, and in our most recent measurement in 2012, it's way down. It's down at 10%. On the other hand, that's 29 million people who wake up every morning saying they want government to do something on this issue. So the question is, what do they want to have happen? Now, on most issues, oh, sorry, before I do that, let me just show you this. So this is the global warming 10%. And that 10% is in the middle of a variety of other issues. So these are other issue publics. So this is 17% of people who are very passionate about gun control, 16% about U.S. military spending, 12% about women's rights, and so on. So 10% is, is not unreasonable for many of these issues that have had long histories. Okay, so now, on most of these issues, when you look at the issue public, that group of people is split about evenly on the more liberal side of the issue and the more conservative side. So if you take the gun control issue public, about half of those passionate people want strict gun control laws, and about half of them want no gun control laws. So you can see why that's not very helpful for a legislator, right? Somebody in Congress, among the passionate people, they don't lean one way or another. It's not really pushing them. But climate change is different. In fact, it's the only issue public we've seen like this. These are the percentages of people in the issue public, among the passionate people, in each of these years, who said global warming has been happening, it's been caused by humans, government should do more. These are gigantic numbers. Among the passionate people, overwhelmingly, they are on the green side of the issue. They're telling government to do something. So did those people vote based on climate change? And if they are overwhelmingly on the green side, did a candidate taking a green position get more votes, and did a candidate taking a skeptical anti-green position get less votes? So the first method that we used is one where we looked at what the candidates said during the 2010 congressional campaigns by doing a content analysis of their websites. And we categorized each candidate as either saying green stuff or saying not green stuff, or either saying nothing or being mixed. And so let me show you what the candidates said. Among the Democrats running for the Senate, 43% of them said nothing on climate change. 57% of them took a green position on climate change. And none of them took a skeptical position on climate change. So this is very helpful to me, because I want differences between the candidates so that I can look at statistically whether it makes a difference whether they're green or not. We'll do that in a moment. Among the Republicans running in the Senate, 83% of them said nothing. 9% took a green position, and 9% took a not green position. Okay? And the same thing is true for the candidates running in the House. Among the Democrats, 40% said nothing, 60% took a green position, and 1% took a not green position. So again, the Democrats tend to be more green, but they're certainly not completely green. And among the Republicans, 78% said nothing, 6% took a green position, and 16% took a not green position. So now, let's look at, did climate change strategy correlate with victory rates? Okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the percent of races in which the Democrats won. And we're going to begin by looking only at the races in which the Democrats said nothing about climate change and the Republicans said nothing about climate change. Okay? And the percent here is a tiny 17%. The Democrats did not do well. 83% of those races were won by Republicans. Okay? Now, what happens if we keep the Republicans silent, but now we look at the races in which the Democrat took a green position? So I propose to you that that should help, right? But that Politico headline said it should hurt. Which is it? What's going to happen to that number? Well, it surges up to 69%. moving from saying nothing to taking a green position. Okay, now, the next comparison is holding the Democrat constant, taking a green position. Now, the Republican is going to take a not green position. So you have the Democrat on the green side, the Republican on the not green side. Do the Republicans help themselves by being not green in that situation? The answer is not at all. 68% of these races were won by the Democratic candidate. So as long as the Democrat is the green one, this is associated with a much higher victory rate. Now, we're going to compare keeping the Democrat green. Now, what if the Republican is also green? Now they're not different anymore, right? You can't actually use this race to choose between them because they're the same. What happens? Wow, it goes right back down to 18% in this case. So all of the advantage of the Democrat being green disappears when the Republican is green. Okay, now we're going to compare the both silent condition to the cases in which the Democrat was silent and the Republican took a not green position. Okay, so my prediction would be here that taking that not green position would hurt the Republican. But in fact, it didn't. The Republicans won even more races. So they won 96% of these races. So as long as the Democrat says nothing, the Republican going not green helped. But look back over here. When the Democrat confronts the not green Republican by being green, the Democrat's victory rate is much, much higher. Okay, the last comparison here. What if the Democrat is silent and the Republican goes green? Didn't happen a lot, but what happens? Well, in that case, the Republican won every single race. So this pattern is completely consistent with the idea that votes are to be gained by going green. But we don't know what, we don't know what caused what here, right? All we know is that we're describing different groups of candidates. We don't know whether it was the climate change positions that caused the votes. So, in particular, what we wanted to do was to do a more complex statistical analysis in a regression format that's controlling for lots of other variables that I'm not going to describe. But when you look up here at this number with these little asterisks on it, and this number right here with these little asterisks on it, and these two, and this number here with the asterisks, this tells you everything I just showed you is real and remains even after we control for other potentially confounding factors. But still, this is what is now called an observational study, right? It's a correlational study. So the question is, how can I learn more about the causal impact of the candidate statements on climate? Well, what we're going to do next is we're going to look at a survey experiment. So here, what we did was we did another national random digit dial telephone survey in which all respondents hear the interviewer describe a hypothetical candidate running for Senate. They say, next I'd like to read you some quotes from that the person might say if they're running for the Senate. And I'd like to ask you to tell me whether you agree or disagree with each of the quotes. And then at the end, the respondent is asked, now that I've told you all this, please tell me how likely you are to vote for or against the candidate. Okay? So each respondent hears either 2 or 3 quotes. The 2 quote people hear quotes about issues other than climate change. So there's 1/3 of the sample who are in the control group. They don't hear the candidate say anything about climate. Another 1/3 of the sample, they are in the green condition. They hear the candidate make a green statement on climate. And then the final 1/3 are in the not green condition. They hear the candidate make a not green statement. So we're manipulating between subjects what the candidate said on the issue. So let me show you, first of all, here's the green, I'll describe the control group's procedure. So they heard, for example, quotes on terrorism or the economy. They were asked whether they agreed or disagreed with each one. And then, based on everything you've heard, would you definitely vote for the candidate, probably for, probably against, or definitely against? Okay. So here is the quote from the green candidate for 1/3 of the respondents. And I'm going to read this to you. Like most Americans and most of the residents of our great state, I believe that global warming has been happening for the last 100 years, mainly because we've been burning fossil fuels and putting out greenhouse gases. Now is the time for us to stop this by ending our dependence on imported oil and coal to run our cars and heat our houses, We need to begin using new forms of energy that are made in America and will be renewable forever. We can build better cars that use less gasoline. We can build better appliances that use less electricity. And we can make power from the sun and from wind. We don't have to change our lifestyles, but we do need to reshape the way our country does business. We need to end our long-term addiction to polluting the environment and instead let American genius do what it does best: transform our outdated ways of generating energy into new ones that create jobs and entire industries and stop the damage we've been doing to the environment. So that's what the Green candidate says. This, as you can tell, comes pretty directly from our surveys. So each of the results I showed you earlier has a little place in this. This is just saying back to the voters what they said to us in their survey. Now, here's the not green group. Here's what they heard. And I'll read this as well. There isn't any real science to say that we're changing the climate of the Earth. The science on global warming is a hoax and is an attempt to perpetrate a fraud on the American people. Climate science is junk science, and global warming is a manufactured controversy. I don't buy the whole man-caused global warming, man-caused climate change mantra, and I believe that there's not sound science to back that up. We must spend no effort to deal with something that is not a problem at all. Yet that's exactly what's happening with the cap-and-trade bill that Congress has considered. I oppose the cap-and-trade bill. Cap-and-trade is a job killer and damages our economy. We should not invest in windmills and solar panels as alternative energy sources. Instead, we should continue to focus on our traditional sources of energy: coal, oil, and natural gas. We should expand energy production in our country, including by continuing to mine our coal and doing more drilling for oil here at home. Now, I didn't actually make this up mostly. I took it mostly from Senator Inhofe's website. This is what he says. Okay, so let's see what happens. So we've got the control group, the group who hears the candidate say something green, and the group who hears the candidate say something not green. What percent of people say they would vote for the candidate? Well, in the control group, that's 65%. What happens here in the green group? Where is this going to be? Higher or lower? 77%. 12 percentage points. About the size of the issue public. Interesting. And what about here? When the candidate takes a not green position, compared to the 65, what's this going to be over here? Higher or lower? Lower. 48%. So this is strong causal evidence, right? This is evidence of the causal impact of this issue. Now, if Politico was right, this number would have been down here, but it's not. That this pushed people in the positive direction rather than the negative direction. Now, one argument you can make is that none of this matters for Democrats and for Republicans. That citizens who call themselves Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic candidate. Citizens who call themselves Republicans are going to vote for the Republican. The only people who matter are the independents, who we can't predict. Those are the people who the candidates are trying to convince to vote for them. So let's see what happens. Among Democrats, I'm going to do this very quickly, you see exactly the same pattern. Going green helps, going not green hurts. Among Republicans, actually, the results are remarkably flat. That Republicans are not pulled around much at all. So what about the independents? Well, among the independents, we see exactly the pattern that we saw among the Democrats and in the country as a whole. And it has to be the case, because in order to get those numbers I showed you earlier, these people have to be doing it. And you can see a sizable 16 percentage point increase and almost 20 percentage point decrease here among the independents. So clearly, there are votes to be gained or lost by the right strategy on this issue. Now, the last thing I want to show you is I'm going to divide the country into the issue public, the small group of people who are passionate, and then the rest of the country who are not on this issue. We expect the effect to be bigger in this group. Here's what it looks like in this group. So this is 18 percentage points up and 22 percentage points down among the issue public members. But among the non-members, we see the same pattern, but much weaker. So it's only 9 percentage points up and 4 percentage points down. Okay, so we got the same finding when we looked at Florida and Maine and Massachusetts. And I'm going to show you one result really fast on this is the websites that I'm not going to walk you through. to be fun, but we don't need them, because I already told you about them. Look at all that funness. Okay, so this is predicting voting in the 2008 US presidential election. We have lots of predictors here. Liberal conservative ideology, being a Democrat or Republican, approving of George Bush's performance, perceiving the economy to be doing well or badly, and so on. We have 3 different calculation methods here, the city block method, the Euclidean method, and the directional method. These are, political scientists are not in agreement about which of these is the best one to do, so we did all of them. And the important thing I want you to see is right here, this number, see those asterisks right there? That number and those asterisks, and that number and those asterisks. What that tells you is controlling for everything else in this equation with data from the 2008 election survey that we did, that we can predict voting based upon people's positions on global warming. The closer they thought they were to Barack Obama, the more likely they were to vote for Barack Obama. That's what that indicates, over and above all this other stuff. So the net result here, and by the way, that effect is big and significant among the issued public members, and it is nowhere near significant among the non-members. Okay, so we're at the end of the data. So what conclusions can we reach? Well, first of all, a majority, sorry, this is a little small, a majority of Americans are green and have been for quite some time on this issue. There are no regions of majority skepticism in the country. That it is a priority issue for people. People appear willing to pay enough to actually make the reductions happen. And taking green positions helped candidates, whereas taking not green positions hurt candidates. As expected, that impact was concentrated among issued public members. Therefore, candidates clearly have incentives to be green. Furthermore, candidates clearly have incentives to pass green legislation on the issue. So why haven't they? Well, the answer is clearly not the public. Unless legislators don't know what I just told you. Right? Unless they see other poll results that tell other stories using other question wordings or other methodologies. And so one potential answer to the dilemma is that. It is that legislators don't actually understand all of this in this way. So I'm here and I give talks in lots of places and we write stuff up in an effort to publicize our work. We will be going to Washington a week from today to do a press conference at the National Press Club and then a briefing in the Congress on this work and our latest surveys in this area. And we'll continue to disseminate it. But there are other organizations doing surveys in America. They ask different questions. They use different methods. They don't always produce the same kinds of results. And so I think, well, we will talk this week about evidence we have on the fact that Americans don't actually know what Americans think about this issue. When we ask them, what % of Americans do you think believe the planet's been warming and so on, people often get that wrong. So our goal partly is to help the country understand itself better and to do more work at the state level. But there's another possibility as well, right? Maybe even after the legislators know everything I told you, some of them still won't vote for it. Even ones in states that have large majorities on the green side. Why might that be? Well, one hypothesis is money. That campaign contributions from oil, coal, gas companies, car companies, others who are committed to continuing to burn fossil fuels might say to legislators, please don't do anything on this issue. So imagine that there's actually a very powerful program that was aired on the public broadcasting program called Frontline. I don't know, can you watch public broadcasting programs here from the US? I think you might be able to. So PBS are the initials, and the reporter is a woman named Carl Davenport. And this 1 hour long news program was about how the oil, coal, gas industry has been spending money to try to create skepticism about climate change and pressuring legislators to say nothing about the issue. So you saw those Republicans, so many of the Republicans said nothing. the agenda of this news story was to say, well, it's because they're being paid to say nothing, basically. The companies are saying, we will give you contributions if you agree to say nothing on the issue. Now imagine that you are a candidate, and an oil company comes to you and says, we'll give you lots of money if you agree to say nothing about climate change. Now, you can, if you want to, it's up to you, you can say stuff about climate change, we just won't give you the money. So you do a little calculus, and you say, well, okay, I could turn down the money, and I could take a green position, and then maybe I would gain some votes from that. But I could also say nothing about climate change, take the money, and then spend the money on advertising so I can buy votes that way. So they might say, yeah, I think I'd rather do that. Except, as it turns out, I don't know if you've watched this, but in the last 5 to 10 years, political scientists have finally gotten around to doing really good studies of whether political advertising during campaigns actually wins votes. And the answer looks like it doesn't. So they can take the money from the companies and spend it on the advertising, but it doesn't actually help them gain any more votes as a result. They would have been better off just taking the green position on climate change, as far as this is concerned. So, interesting little twist to that story. Now, I have absolutely no data to support what I just said. I have no evidence that contributions from companies are affecting how legislators vote in Congress. But we are involved now in testing exactly that hypothesis. So Julia Purcell, who is an undergraduate at Stanford, is the head of a group of students who are gathering up the data needed to do this analysis. And they've built a gigantic data file. We're getting very close to actually being able to push the button on the regression and see what the results look like. It's a huge data gathering enterprise, but a really interesting one. And we will see whether we can predict which legislators are voting how based on what factors. So in this regression, one of the predictors is going to be these survey results. In other words, for each senator and congressional representative, we know what proportion of his or her state is on the green side on climate. So we would predict that if they're paying any attention at all to their voters, that in the states where there are large majorities green, huge majorities green, that they will be more likely to vote for the climate bill when the majorities are small. On the other hand, we might predict that when they're getting lots of money contributed by oil, coal, gas companies, car companies, and so on, that they will vote against those bills more than if they're not taking that kind of money from those candidates. So we'll see. We'll be looking at lots of predictors, and we'll find out. Hopefully next time I visit you here, I can tell you an update on what those results look like. But in the meantime, I hope that what I've told you during our conversation this afternoon gives you a sense of a number of things. First of all, how somebody like me with a degree in psychology and training in survey research methods can go about doing science to try to illuminate what the public thinks and to understand something about the interplay between public and government. So we do surveys like this on lots of issues. Our goal is to understand what Americans believe, what they want government to do, what they don't want government to do, and to try to illuminate that, the depth of the thinking, in order to help the country operate better. So I leave it to you to decide whether you think it really helps or not, but I hope it gives you a sense of how we do the science. And I hope you also have a sense of how survey research can be done in this arena, and how careful question wording, careful analysis, repeated surveys over time, and experiments embedded in surveys, as well as multivariate statistical analysis, can all be used together in multi-method investigations to illuminate different aspects of the same phenomenon, producing a more powerful package of evidence in the long run. After all, we are scientists. We need good data, and we need good analytic tools, and we need to be able to transcend an addiction to any one analytic method by looking at many analytic methods and many different sources of data to triangulate in on the validity of particular hypotheses. That's what we try to do, and I hope you in your own work will consider that as well. Lastly, I want to just end by thanking you once again for the invitation and the opportunity to spend the time with you and for your attention this afternoon. It's a privilege for me to get to talk to you, and I appreciate your openness to this work, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So thank you.